Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the September speaking series. Today, this talk will be recorded and it's live right now on Air Mozilla. Today's talk is going to be about should I put it on Yammer? As you know, Yammer is a tool we use for communication, online communication. But this talk is really more about all online communication and how we treat each other and why it's important. So Mozilla, we're very geographically distributed, and we rely every day on asynchronous communication. We all can't be in the same room. Mozilla employs around 1,100 people with hundreds of volunteers. We operate in over 90 different geographic regions. We're from different backgrounds, different disciplines, but we're all working on a common purpose. So effective online communication is vital to getting our mission done. So this is a hard lesson. Every time we write a blog post or an email or send a tweet, we're having an effect on people. And we can either leave those people a little bit better than they are or a little bit worse. And it's pretty easy to leave them a little bit worse. So, and I'm no stranger to writing pretty tough emails. It's really easy, and the unintended consequences can be pretty bad. So, I was thinking of like different stories that, I could bring up. I did look at two things in my email. I looked at the last 18 months of my sent email and how many smiley faces I had. It's sort of funny. I sent over 1,500 smiley faces in my email in the last 18 months. And that's really kind of an indication like this medium is pretty horrible for showing what body positioning you have or what gestures you make. And I'm sure a lot of you also do the same thing. If you want to make sure that the other person is going to be okay after reading or know your position, you send a smiley face or what have you. So this is not going to be fixed today. It's probably not going to be fixed in a year, but we constantly have to improve our online communication. So with that, I'd like to introduce Deanna Zandt. She is the co-founder and partner at Lux Digital. She's the author of Share This, How You Will Change the World with Social Networking. She's generously offered to talk about this area and the neuroscience behind some of the reasons we do the things we do. So, if you will, round of applause.
Thank you. Oh, I got to unmute myself. Technology. Voice of God. Hello. That's what it always feels like when you first get your mic turned on and you're doing public speaking. It's like, I'm everywhere. So I'm super excited to be here. I'm such a big giant nerd. Actually, one of my defining moments in my history with the internet was in 1994 when I was a first-year student in college. One of my friends in the computer science department showed me the first graphical browser, and I was like, "Oh my God! It has pictures and colors!" So to be sitting in this room with you all and being with you all online, what up, IRC, is super, super exciting for me. And I do a lot of work these days, specifically at the intersection of emotion and technology and like how we're actually interacting with each other. I remember, again, 1994, I think a lot about, Usenet. And people talk about, trolling and harassment and all this stuff. And I'm like, kids, let me tell you about Usenet in 1994. It was amazing. It was one color. We had text only. So great. And so I've had a ton of experience and a variety of experience to bring to the table. And one of the things that's clearest to me in the research that I've been able to read and participate in, and in the work that I've done, we work with movements, films, nonprofits. We help people create measurable emotional resonance in my agency, which is like, ooh, that feels so nice and tingly. But one of the things through all of that I have discovered is that we're all jerks. I'm a jerk, you're a jerk, we're all jerks. And we can start out with this, and I know this because I have one of the greatest advisors of New York City. This is Johnny T. And he's going to explain what it means to be a jerk. And he's talking about tourists here in New York City specifically, but this applies to all of us and how we interact with one another. So let's go ahead and cue up the video. Tony, how about that?
I'm here to give you the inside scoop, but let's get one thing straight, all right? You're a jerk. Hey, don't get me wrong. I want you to come experience my beautiful city, but you're a tourist. That means you're a jerk. Hey, buddy, don't take it personal, all right? When I go on vacation where you live, I become the jerk. Hey, look at me. I am in South Dakota. I'm gonna ask directions and take your picture and not go to work when you're trying to go to work. You see that? Jerk.
So the whole point of this is that we're all jerks at some point, right? When we interact with each other at some point, there's lots of different reasons for this. And when I was talking to Diana and Doug about what happens in online communications here specifically, they said, come tell us what you think. And I said, well, we're all a bunch of jerks, especially saying it the way Johnny T says. But there's a reason for that. And as it turns out, it's because we're all human. Yes? They're what? I think they're ready to no, that's just the slide from, yeah, thank you. This is an interactive presentation, so excellent. So the reason why we're all jerks is because, as it turns out, we're all human, and all humans are jerks. But there's lots of things that we can do about that. And I want to take a look at some basic human features that kind of come into play when we're looking at this. So this is the kind of neuroscience stuff that we started talking about pretty early on. And this is, to me, is one of the most fascinating things about how we're hardwired to fail miserably at digital communication. Ready for this? Okay. So it turns out that, we all know that tone and body language play a huge part in how somebody interprets a message, right? Like if I digitally say that was the best movie ever, that is a big difference between me going, that was the best movie ever. There's huge differences in that, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But it turns out there's neuroscience that shows us that what is actually happening when there is absent body language and tone, messages coming in and information coming in doesn't get shot up into our higher emotional processing places and cortices in our brains. It goes straight back to our amygdalas. Who knows what the amygdala does? Come on, y'all are nerds. It's fight or flight. That's your fight or flight syndrome, right? And so basically, when you get a message in and you're reading it in text only, there's no body language, there's no tone, you have no extra information, and how this is being interpreted. If it doesn't sit quite well with you, it goes straight back to your amygdala, and your body goes and your brain goes, "Oh my God, I'm being chased by cheetahs right now. I'm being chased by cheetahs, and I have to respond accordingly." So if somebody says to you, "I think that's kind of not the best idea I've ever heard," via text. Without any of those cues, your body goes, "Oh my God, I've got to set you on fire," or like run away, or any of these things. Like all of these communications are up for grabs. Which when I started Googling for images of cheetahs, I actually found a picture of this guy screaming, which is from a WikiHow article on how to fight off a cheetah attack. Just so we're all clear, but it's like similarities, right? Like huge similarities in how we can react to one another. So that's the first set of hardwiring that's at play. So you have this, if I put in tone, if I put in body language, if I can see facial expressions, there's something like, I just heard this really great interview about facial expressions, and this computer, these people that I've taught an AI to recognize 30,000 different facial expressions and the emotions associated with them. That's something that our brains are doing all the time. If you don't have that information at all, cheetahs chasing me and yelling at me. So the second one is as it turns out, we're hardwired for empathy. That to me was a really stunning discovery in the work that I started doing. In that it turns out, we talk a lot about Darwinism. That's why he's there, and kind of survival of the fittest, and like whoever we've twisted it. This idea, especially sociologically, to whoever can be the most aggressive, whoever can be the most dominant, whoever can be the most intense is who survives. And that's actually not true. That's actually not the point of Darwinism, especially sociologically. Darwinism, for humans and for primates, it turns out that collaboration and getting along with each other is actually hugely important for the survival of the species. And how we've evolved over time is that we actually have these empathetic hardwiring centers built into our brains, which I find totally fascinating, that we want to be empathetic with one another, because if I recognize what's happening with you and I understand it, and I can either work with you or run screaming from you or whatever, but we are designed to be in tune with one another. Who has heard of mirror neurons? Awesome. Would you like to tell the class, or are you shy? Yes, exactly. Yes, I will. They make you feel what other people are feeling when you see that happening. So there's a subset of neurons in your brain that if I see someone being touched on the arm, my brain actually tries to reproduce that experience. There's a great TED talk about this. If you go to TED and look for mirror neurons, it's so unbelievably cool. They've done these great experiments. We try to reproduce all the time, constantly. Our brains are constantly trying to reproduce what's happening to other people, specifically other humans around us. We want to know what's happening. We want to experience it ourselves so that we can participate and socialize. It turns out, newsflash, humans are social. It's an incredible thing. And when that comes to online communication, it's a really tall order to make that jump between cheetahs chasing us and trying to be empathetic and collaborate and be nice to one another. We're at a pretty critical place where we have to make choices, very conscious and intentional choices. We have to invoke intentionally our higher human processing power to be able to figure out how we're actually going to be able to exist and not just survive on the planet together, but be able to actually thrive on the planet together. If we act on every single impulse of cheetahs chasing us, we are all doomed. We are all doomed, and we have to be able to do this together. So when I was discussing these ideas of this kind of foundation of how we get along with one another with Doug and Diane, which, by the way, I made you guys a little graphic. I think they should have a morning drive time show. It should be the Doug and Diane show, just based on their names alone, like totally work marketing-wise, but also they are hilarious and amazing to work with on this stuff. And I was pouring out lots of like touchy-feely, squishy, like, oh my gosh, like I'm a Buddhist, and everything's amazing, and I want to hug everybody. We're getting into this, and Doug was really great because he was like, "Well, I have a big question here." He said, "Why not be a jerk? Like what? Like maybe like sometimes it's necessary. Like sometimes it's necessary. Like why not? Like." And again, like that old, inner old lady came out in me, and I was like, because your mother told you to be nice to people, all right? I was like, that's not a good enough answer. But he's right, why not? I want to show you guys this. I highly recommend this book. One, he's my client, so there's that. But two, I actually, and this so rarely happens sometimes, I actually really, really enjoyed reading this book. It's a new book that's out. He's a Stanford business school guy, and it's called Leadership BS, if that gives you any indication of the tone of the awesomeness of this book. And he wrote it originally as a rant of how how awful it is that we're inundated with these terrible platitudes that to be a successful leader, you have to be authentic, and you have to have modesty, and all of these things. Knowing that those things, especially if you're a woman or you're a person of color, acting as a leader who's being authentic and modest and all of those things, that will actually tear you down. It will actually destroy your career. And there's statistics and research in this book talking a lot about why those things don't actually work. And there's a quote I'm going to read you from him from his recent from a recent LinkedIn post that he wrote about why he wrote this book. And he said, modesty, authenticity, telling the truth, building trust, taking care of others, all great traits and virtues, in fact. But sort of like hand washing in medicine, there's remarkably little attention to the base rate, how often such characteristics occur in the world, even among, or maybe particularly among, the most admired business leaders like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Larry Ellison, Donald Trump, almost completely the opposite. So there's this profound disconnect between what we tell people to do and seemingly how we want them to be. And he goes on. And so I started, as I was reading this, I was like, well, geez, that sounds like that might be completely the opposite of what I was just talking about being empathetic and being intentional and all of these things, but it turns out, no, false dichotomy. These things are not actually mutually exclusive. And as a New Yorker, I grew up in upstate New York, and I've lived in New York City for almost 20 years now. I can tell you that there's a really big difference between being direct and being a straight shooter and being a jerk. There's a huge difference. Being direct in New York doesn't make you a jerk, it makes you efficient. And we like efficiency because we have no time for any of your BS. So none of what I'm talking about should be interpreted as having to choose that kind of directness and efficiency and necessary honesty when it calls for it in favor of being nicer. I think that that's the confusion where we get into problems with this kind of squishiness of being empathetic, is we have this idea that we need to be nice to one another. And I'm actually not interested in niceness at all. I'm a jerk. I don't think that anybody really needs to spend their time being nice to one another, being nice to their teams. I'm also not interested in happiness, but that's another story. And woo, we'll get there. But I think a lot about that there's a difference between being nice and being compassionate in the work that we do, and compassionate in our intention and how we treat one another. And that's because I'm a Buddhist. And there it is. I told you it would come. I'm warning you. I dropped it. Here it is. Compassion in having a difficult conversation, whether that's online or offline, is not necessarily the nicest choice. The most compassionate choice that you can make in any situation is not necessarily the nicest thing. If I'm unhappy in a romantic relationship and I say, it's not you, it's me, that's shitty. That's just straight up shitty, right? But if I say to you, I'm suffering, incredibly under the weight of your needs, and I don't think I can meet your needs anymore, that's difficult, and that's compassionate because I'm being direct and I'm being honest with you. And that's something that other person probably needs to hear. There's a huge difference of this. So one of my biggest takeaways in looking at leadership BS too is something that I wanted to bring to the table here. The leaders in your work, the leaders of projects, of teams, of the entire organization are going to have to recognize that being intentional about making the compassionate choice and acting compassionately, not nicely, not authentically, not even modestly, and figuring out your online communication needs for one another, they're going to have to recognize that there is emotional labor involved in how we act with one another and how we are involved with one another. We want to believe that just our default states of being and our default ways of being are just naturally what happens in the world. But we are humans and social for a reason. We can choose to act intentionally and compassionately. The leaders of these groups and these projects are going to recognize that in ruling this giant, unruly community of incredible badasses. I love Mozilla so much. I love the community. I love the volunteers. I love open source. Like, I love everything about this. And everything that's happening here, we all have to step up to the plate. And if we value the work that we're doing, we're going to have to value and be compassionate towards one another. And that doesn't mean being nice, it just means don't be a jerk, don't be mean. Sometimes that means that, as Doug put it to me, there's a time where you have to be the coach that, yells at you over and over to get it right, because that's actually the compassionate, loving choice. So I interviewed a friend of mine, my friend Adam Mordecai. Hi, Adam, if you're watching. He is an editor-at-large at Upworthy. Do you all know Upworthy? Yeah, right? So on the front-facing end of like Upworthy is like, hey, everything's amazing in the world, like big giant smiles. But they're also an entirely distributed staff. Nobody works pretty much in the same place as one another. And they also have to rely a lot on online communication and digital communication, text-based stuff to get their work done. And they struggled with this as well. Like any organization, we're all bringing something to the table, whether that's privilege, whether that's experience, whether that's trauma from prior workplaces or projects that we've worked on. We all get a little twitchy when we hear certain, trigger words and things like that. So I asked him, I said, it'd be really interesting, like, how do you guys actually manage this? And how do you keep your communications productive? And he gave me, actually, there is a tool. It's this secret, magic, silver bullet. There was extra side effects. That was awesome. Thank you for this really dramatic moment. What's that? It was the magic bullet being fired upstairs. And I'm about to reveal it to you guys. It's a really big deal. I hope you're ready for it. Video chat. They rely super heavily on video chat. So anytime anything gets heated in any of their communications, whether that's their email list, their chat rooms, any of the projects that they're working on, their teams, organizationally, leaders of those specific moments or those specific projects are invoked to step in and interrupt and to say, this is no longer a productive conversation. You all have to take this to some sort of in-person or video chat. And the leaders follow up with them to make sure that happens. And as Adam says, it's harder to jump to conclusions about someone's intent when you can see their facial expressions. That was 30,000 facial expressions that we were just talking about. Absolutely influence how you interpret something. And it's so unbelievably critical that when things are going south, that somebody steps in and says, time out, we're not going to do this anymore. I realize also, that's really complicated in an organization that's super dedicated to transparency and to, kind of open sourcing everything that, nobody wants to recognize, to have like kind of private conversations. And, we can talk about in the Q&A some of the nuances of what that might look like. But what happens when you stick people together in a room in video chat, make them work their stuff out, have some sort of, they're given a facilitated framework for how to work out their issue, the cheetahs kind of disappear. The cheetahs kind of pull back, and they get to see and hear each other. And I asked Adam, why this was so important to them, and he gets quote of the day here. He said, having a genius on the project is useless if they're an asshole to everyone, right? So the platform is actually not the solution. The humans are the solution. And I do want to talk a little bit, something else that Adam brought up that's really important in understanding also just how we interact and communicate with one another all together. And this specifically gets, again, magnified massively online is, dun, 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 the drama triangle. Who knows what the drama triangle is? Yes. Anybody? Okay, cool. So this is a psychological and sociological framework from, I think, the mid-'60s. And I can't remember the guy's name right now, but there are these three roles in every kind of interaction, group interaction. There's the persecutor. The persecutor is the jerk who's critical, who's outward-facing, who points everything that's going wrong is somebody else's problem and is blaming someone and is persecuting them. the victim feels helpless and feels paralyzed and feels hopeless that anything will ever change, and continues to interact in that dynamic of being criticized over and over to the point where they feel like they can't get anything done. And then here is where things get really messed up and complicated, is there's the rescuer / enabler who is also interacting in this situation. They're trying to intervene in theory to make things better, and often they're only making things worse. Underneath and kind of psychologically, it's been shown that rescuers and enablers are actually only intervening because they're avoiding their own problems. So yeah, there's no baggage there whatsoever, right? And like this just constantly feeds itself and festers in any kind of conflict-oriented situation. And it's really, really hard to step out of it and to recognize that it's even happening. And there's this quote from a guy named Sam Robinson, and he says it persists because it often fulfills some unmet need for the players, where we can focus on the humans and not on what's actually happening, right? That's the point of this, is that if we can recognize, again, our human brains, the way they're constructed, if I can recognize, look at this and say, there are roles that are being played, and I can focus on those roles, it relieves me from actually having to solve the problem at hand. And so one of the biggest things that we need to do in these situations and in these really difficult conversations of any kind that we're having is to be able to pull back and look at the real causes of conflict. A huge part of that is that, again, leadership has to recognize and intervene in this kind of culture and encourage people to look at their behavior. And I think that can happen through compassionate, intentional interaction. So I want to give you guys a couple of little points to share of what you can do to individually and collectively to kind of take yourselves out of these like crazy situations. So the first one I call stop, drop, and think. Remember stop, drop, and roll? Remember, like, don't run with the fire. If you think cheetahs are chasing you, the first thing that you have to do is stop and think about the situation and have compassion for yourself. This is, again, super, Buddhist-y woo-woo thing, but if you start by having compassion for yourself and figuring out what your own thing is and what you're bringing to the table and the trauma that you've had or the difficulties that you've had, you are asking yourself to engage those higher cortices, those higher processing powers that we all come with to the table. And it's scary, and it makes you vulnerable, and but it brings you out of that triangle of focusing on the people and rather, refocusing on the problem. So you ask yourself, is this person, is this conflict, is this problem actually trying to completely undermine everything I've held dearly to me since I was a little tiny baby? Is that actually what's happening right now? And, maybe the answer is yes, and you'll have to figure out how to deal with that. But chances are that's not actually the case. But how do you actually do that? Like, how, especially in the heat of the moment, like how do you distill, like, the noise and find the signal and like get to the nut of what's really important? So my friend Ann Friedman, anybody familiar with journalist Ann Friedman? Awesome, she's amazing. She came up with this thing that she calls the Disapproval Matrix. And she's looking at this at wider online communications, but I think it can also be useful in project work and in teamwork. So she has this matrix, and I'll just, for those that have a difficult time seeing, I'll just kind of briefly give you the run through here that she uses. So the axes are rational to irrational and know you to don't know you. And this is looking at these 4 quadrants in any kind of situation where you're like, okay, do I have to pay attention to what's actually happening right now? And do I have to pay attention to the experience that's happening? People who are rational and who know you are the lovers. They want to see you improve and thrive. They give an F about you. I told my mom I wouldn't drop F-bombs. The critics are rational people who don't know you, people who are experts in your field who are criticizing the work and not you. That's a huge thing. Again, going back to that drama triangle, that is the huge difference. Me saying, you're a jerk and I hate you and you're stupid is different than I have problems with how you're constructing this particular architecture, right? Like those are 2 really different statements. And so if people are criticizing your work Recognize that's not a cheetah chasing you. They're actually trying to get to the bottom of what problem you're trying to solve. Where it gets fun are the irrational. The irrational people who know you, your frenemies, the people who don't really want to see you improve, people who are interested in undermining you. These are the kind of, somewhere they fluctuate in between the persecutor and the victim. Either they're the victim all the time or they're yelling at you all the time. Other folks and frenemies are exes, toddlers, undermining coworkers, and also yourself. That nasty little voice inside your head that says, you don't know what you're talking about and you should probably just shut up. Recognize that that is your frenemy. And then the really fun ones who don't know you, who are irrational, the haters. YouTube commenters, jealous ignoramuses, and lesser rappers. Those are the people that you can kind of just entirely write off. Those are the people that are irrationally criticizing you or have no foundation in what they're bringing to the table. So that's that kind of first part of how we create intentional, compassionate communication with one another. The other part of it is be excellent to one another, you know, like Bill and Ted. Is that too old a reference? No? Okay, great. Thanks. Just turned 40 this year. It's settling in. So you have no idea what's going on with anybody else at any given moment. Even if you think that you do, you actually have no idea. Your comment on their project or in your interaction, you may be the straw that broke the camel's backs. We're all carrying multiple selves and we're all carrying these burdens. We're all bringing these things to the table. I remember, this summer I was out shopping with my mom and my mom was buying cat litter and it accidentally got rung up on the person in front of hers, Bill, and my mom just, and was like, oh, I'm so sorry. And the woman was just like, and really made this big deal of like what a pain in the ass that was and like how, and like they had to go to customer service and get the thing and with and the woman was just like, and my mom was like, geez, you're kind of overreacting a little bit, don't you? I mean, it's just cat litter and like it was all resolved in like 3 minutes, and I was like, well, you don't know, like you have no idea what just happened to her before that. And if we recognize that, people don't know necessarily what's going on with you and they're making comments and interacting with you in certain ways, you don't know what's going on with them either. I also went through a major multi-year depressive episode and nobody had any idea online because I was so good at hiding everything that I was going through, which reminded me just as we were talking about it this week, did you guys see this thing go by of how people lie about their lives on Instagram, which I think sums this up so unbelievably well, of like, what the Instagram picture is and like what's actually happening in their lives, remembering that is actually what everyone is bringing to the table when they're interacting with one another, especially online, especially where it's so easy for us to construct a self that is powerful and that is really has their shit together. This is, I included this one too, because this is seriously my life. Like, this is actually what my life looks like. And then, like, when I post a picture online, I'm like, oh, sunset. It's so nice. So I want to bring Jeffrey Pfeffer in one more time before we wrap this shindig up and get to the Q&A, because I truly believe that what he's preaching in Leadership BS, this conventional wisdom about what makes a leader great, is completely unfounded. And being compassionate with one another in our interaction, like those two things are not at odds. Because he says if we want to create less toxic work environments, if we want leaders who don't fail themselves in their workplaces so frequently, we need to get beyond sentiment and sentimentality and understand at a deep level why the world of work is as it is. Only then will we have the remotest chance that anything will change. We all have a huge opportunity to continually iterate and shape the culture that we work in, that we exist in, and that we communicate in. That's because we are the droids that we have been looking for. We are the ones that we have been waiting for. That's it. Thank you. Yay! IRC peeps, Where are my IRCers at? That was actually the first meetup I ever went to, was from an IRC channel in 1996.
Really?
Yeah, we decided to all meet up in person, and I was still in college at the time, and we were all going to a concert together in New York. And I was going to drive, explaining to my parents, in 1996, that I was going to drive to New York City to go to a concert with a bunch of people that I met on the internet. My mom was like, axe murderers! And she made me take 2 of my offline friends with me. And it was the best thing ever.
What IRC channel?
Oh, you're going to make me say it, aren't you?
Yeah, of course I am.
It was the Bare Naked Ladies.
Very good.
Because I'm from upstate New York, and it was the 90s. That's what we did. And they had a New Year's Eve concert in the city, and it was amazing. It was just an incredible experience. It was my first time meeting strangers on the internet, and I was just like, oh my God, you look everything like I thought you were gonna look like. Anyway, yes.
So, does anyone have any questions on IRC? I have a few while you think of your questions. So, you mentioned a couple good strategies to deal with criticism or attacks online, right? Where we stop and think, and we realize what we're reading might not have the impact that it intends. When you get an email that criticizes you, or I'm sure that's never happened, but
oh no,
yeah, I'm wondering, how do you,
as a feminist on the internet?
Yeah, how do you deal with that, right?
So a couple of things for me. I've been to therapy because I'm a New Yorker, and so basically when you move to New York, you sign your lease, and then you have to sign this little rider that's like, and you're going to get therapy because you want to live here, right? And you're like, yeah, all right, I'll go to therapy, sure, whatever. Which is actually really useful. So I think it's a really individualized thing. There's a couple of different layers to that. When you get that incoming criticism, especially, who's been interneting while feminist, interneting while brown, interneting, we've all experienced this random just lob stuff. And for me, I recognize immediately that it's actually not about me at all. I'm a lightning rod in that particular moment for whatever fear or, thing is actually happening for that person. Actually, just to have a good example. So again, let me tell you about the old days. So when I was writing my book in 2009, not that long ago, but I decided to crowdfund writing the book. And that was a huge deal at the time. Kickstarter was still in private beta. And a bunch of people, weirdly in the UK, kind of caught wind of this and decided that I was completely the harbinger of doom for the entire publishing industry. And, they were having these whole, discussions on Twitter, not including me, by the way. I was like, yeah, because I'm really hard to find online. How do we find that girl? Oh, my gosh. And it culminated into the book's editor of The Guardian writing this super snarky hit piece on me. And I'm a Leo. I have the same birthday as Madonna, so I'm very well, no such thing as bad PR. At least I got a good picture. I sent it to my mom. I'm like, check it out. Somebody hates me. So that was one thing. But when I started asking people, it was a piece of advice that I got from Tara Hunt, who is an amazing digital influencer, strategist person, one of my favorite people on the planet. And, her tactic is always to say, how did you come to that conclusion? Or how do you come to that feeling? And so I started asking people on Twitter that were participating in this conversation. I said, how did you come to the conclusion that I'm a dilettante and I don't know what I'm doing? And immediately they were like, oh, well, I didn't mean you. I didn't mean you, the human. I meant you, the cartoon I have constructed in my head of you. And it's pretty easy to kind of do that. I think that's the biggest thing, though, is to recognize, I knew that it wasn't about me. I knew that people really fear what's going to happen to authors who are trying to support themselves with their writing. What is going to happen to them in the new paradigm and the new economy? That's a real fear. It's not about me. Turns out, as giant of an ego as I have, it actually isn't about me at all. And so that's probably the most number one thing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Two more at the moment. One is, what tips do you have for interacting with people who aren't necessarily gifted at or experienced with being self-aware, that, not taking criticism personally, etc.?
Yeah. So, I'm actually in a discussion about this right now, especially when you have people who are on different spectrums neurologically, and you have kind of neurotypical people interacting, and different standards and norms apply to kind of different communities. It's not easy. What do you do when somebody is totally not self-aware? I think the best thing that you can do is, let me look at the camera. The best thing you can do is, little tiny dot on the wall, is to protect yourself. And actually, everything has to start with yourself, and recognize whatever they're doing is coming out of their place in the world. And there's nothing that you can do to actually change someone. Like, we're getting really into like group therapy here. I realize that, but there really is not a lot you can do. The best thing you can do is again, mantra from my first therapist. She said, she made me say over and over, I'm like a control freak and I have OCD and, kind of all these things. And she used to make me say, I'll do my best work and let the cards fall where they may. And that's really all you can do, especially when you're dealing with people who are just like basically running in the world like this. They're just like, ugh, and like bouncing into everything emotionally. And it's just like, what can I do to protect myself from somebody like that? Next one.
All right. We have another one. What can distributed teams or orgs do when they meet in person? Because we do that sometimes. To help improve the tenor of communications later on when it is, again, online and distributed.
Trust falls. Works every time. Just do the trust fall. Kidding. Those were always so scary at camp because I was just convinced that nobody liked me and like nobody was going to catch me. And I was just like, I'm so nerdy and awful, and they're just going to let me fall and die. So this was actually something that Adam brought up as well, that they have a specific facilitated frameworks of getting people to interact with one another and to do kind of team building exercises. One of the best ones that I ever did, which was like, how somebody tells you like, okay, we're going to start out the meeting doing a little bit of team building here, and you're just like, kill me now. It was basically that kind of situation, but we ended up doing improv together, and they use so there's different frameworks that will get people to do improv to release some of that tension and vulnerability that we have about how we interact with one another. When you're forced to do improv and you're given a very specific set of parameters of how to react to one another, it opens up a lot of space for being like, oh my gosh, I'm not the worst person ever, and neither are you, and we can kind of work with that. So that's just one example, but there's plenty. I'm happy to share resources later of really great facilitators that I know as far as in-person stuff, and yeah, awesome.
Okay, we have one more. I think it's an honest question.
Bring it.
How do you give the quote, I've already answered this question with respect to this question 100,000 times, and you bring it every time we talk, feedback without sounding like a jerk?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, isn't that the worst? I'm not sure I have an answer for that. That really gets into kind of it's so specific to each situation that I'm not sure that there can be a prescription for I'm not entirely, I'll have to, ping me on Twitter with that after. I'm going to give that a little bit of thought, and I definitely want to dig into that, because how do you do that? How do you, it's like we've had this same round and round and round discussion a million times and we're not getting anywhere. I think that there could be something to the idea of, face-to-face interaction that's facilitated with these specific frameworks to help you, again, work through why does this thing keep coming up? There's a theory to the universe in the woo-woo land that you're presented with the same challenge over and over and over until you learn it, until you get it right, and then you can move on from it. So that might be part of it.
We have more.
Oh my God. I was so afraid to go
Folks in the room, don't be shy. You're part of this too. what or how do you have, or what kind of conversation do you have with people that you're managing? So this is from the manager standpoint, who are behaving inappropriately, AKA being a jerk.
Yes. You know, I think it comes back to the compassionate interaction and compassionate intention, and recognizing that that person is not being a jerk because they don't want to be liked. You know, nobody wakes up in the morning and be like, you know what? I am going to get everybody to hate me today, and it's going to be awesome. You know, often people who are acting that, well, maybe some people do, but like often people who are acting out in a certain way are, you know, reenacting prior experiences or trauma that they've had around, you know, a project that they worked on before and are bringing something to the table, or they have even no idea often. I mean, especially in the world of engineering and nerds and you know, like all my peoples, like honestly, not the most aware sometimes that we are being the way we are. And so going to that person and saying, you know, like I'm recognizing like maybe some stuff's going on here, and like can we figure that out. Again, I can post some resources later that really get into some of the specifics of that. But you have to recognize that that person's coming from their place too, and you have no idea what's going on with them.
All right.
My goodness.
I think it's kind of a nuance of some stuff you've talked about already, but so what would be a good way or some good ways to remove yourself from discussions without being a jerk? So if you just kind of want to exit the conversation.
I am the worst at this because I just ghost. Like I'm just like, I do like, you know, some people call it the French exit, some people call it the Irish exit, you know, when you're like leaving the bar and you don't tell anybody and you don't tell your friends you've left and you just leave. Like I'm that girl in kind of group dynamics online where I'm just like, okay, this is clearly no longer something that's going to be useful for me. I feel like people who make that big dramatic, like, I'm unsubscribing from this list, you know, like, because my needs aren't getting met anymore. And I feel like those people, like, that's just another kind of, like, that victim part of the behavior, like, they are trying to attract more attention and more rallying for their position or whatever. And I don't, you know, think that exiting in a very dramatic way is really helpful either. I do think that it's absolutely okay to say, like, this is not working for me, and then going to, like, do we need to have a video chat about this? Do we need to, like, can we, you know, how do we interact? The other thing that Adam mentioned too, by the way, is it's really, really important to have incredibly strong HR people who understand the nuances of online communications. And, you know, we haven't talked about that. I don't know, you know, how that works here, but like that the HR people that may eventually get called in and understand the drama triangle, that they understand online communication and all of its craziness and, you know, kind of all of those things together. So I think a combination. Awesome.
Nothing else on?
No questions from Mountain View?
Yes. Oh, we get to play Donahue.
So I've been in a lot of meetings where maybe the criticism or the tone hasn't been directed at me, but I've seen the dynamics between two other people. Mm-hmm. And what's the right thing to do? Like, do you call someone out in the meeting and say, you know, that's not cool, or do you talk to them later? Like, you know what? I think a lot of people see that probably, or see an exchange online, or see an exchange on IRC. And what advice would you have to them that see this?
Bystander without being the enabler, right? So it's really interesting from both public harassment, specifically street harassment stuff, that do you guys know Hollaback? Do you know the organization Hollaback? Everybody know Hollaback? Yes, friends of mine. They're amazing. They're working on street harassment issues. And we're also seeing this in online harassment work in public spaces, that bystander intervention is actually is pretty critical and actually changes the entire tone of a situation publicly, and in things like in IRC, and you know that could actually be really useful. Again, it's going to entirely depend on the situation, because I also feel like with the enabler stuff that can kind of come into play. You know, it may not be safe for you to do that. You know, like if I see somebody, you know, really harassing a woman on the street, I might not feel safe enough in that position. I might not have enough kind of power in that position to actually change or influence that situation. I might like elbow a dude standing next to me and be like, go talk to that guy, So it's going to be super nuanced for each thing, but bystander intervention can really have a huge effect on changing the tone. I think it comes down to your personality and what you feel safe doing and what you feel is helpful, and experiment with it too. The good thing about most of this stuff is that it's hopefully none of this that we're talking about is like permanent record damage level sort of stuff, and you can experiment and see what happens.
So I have a follow-up on that. So, when this happens, when there's a harassment, or if you see something kind of going, flaming, and I suppose I guess there, in my view, there are probably like two ways to handle that, right? Like either you can be a cop in that situation and like immediately stop it, and and it also depends on if it's something very severe, but if it's just a weird interaction or a really tough conversation, like you can either be a cop in that role or later on, like after the fact, sort of make that a teachable moment and say, hey, like you could have come across in a lot better way if you've done these 5 different things. So like how do you have any advice on how to balance those two things, other than like clearly if it's something somebody's doing illegally, you probably balance more to being a cop.
And there is a big difference between, also just to recognize that there's a big difference between like harassment, flaming, trolling, all of that stuff. I think it comes back a little bit to the disapproval matrix becomes helpful here as well, because if you I'm a big fan of the follow-up after thing of saying, I totally recognizing and validating them, as I totally get where you're coming from, and I think you had really good ideas. It's just that delivery, maybe can we talk about that? One of the other things that we talk a lot about, just in general and how we treat each other in the world is that intention should never trump impact. That's a power structure. In a lot of ways, that if my intention is more important than what impact it's had on the other person, that's a huge power differential. And I can again share some interesting resources around that. So I don't think that there are any kind of specific guidelines, but actually, client I mentioned, Jeffrey Pfeffer, has a book called Power, and it's specifically about organizational dynamics. That also could be super, super useful, and he should come speak here sometime.
Sweet. We have, I think, time for one more
yes.
From IRC. Question is
it where did I get my dress? It glows in the dark and it has pockets.
That is pretty cool. You've talked a lot about individual choice and responsibility and things people can do individually. And you talked a little bit about when people are together as a team, stuff they can do, but a little bit more about team stuff. Like what can teams do to
hug,
rein in? Yeah.
Hug. It's love is the answer. Off the top of my head, I don't have a ton of that, but I have a lot of, because I'm also that girl that still uses Delicious for bookmarking, so thank you very much. I'm old school. I haven't left 2005, evidently, but that's okay. I do actually have a lot of bookmarks on this that, again, I can share on Twitter later, or I can pass on to these guys to share. So I'm sorry I don't have a direct answer for that, but I will get you an answer. I will find an answer. I will hunt it down. And give it to you. It'll happen. Awesome. We're good?
So I just wanted to thank you very much.
Yay!
Thank you for coming here.
Thanks.
Mozilla bag.
Swag. I'm going to walk around New York and just be like, I'm going to be like that annoying kid on the first day of school that's like, check out.
There's stuff in it, too.
It looks
Oh, there's stuff in it. I just like the backpack. Oh, I like things. Oh, my God. This is so great. I lost my, I got a Firefox shirt at a really old South by Southwest, and it got lost, and now I have again. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Thank you for having me.
Thank
you. Yay.
I'd also like to thank the Airmo team and everyone that helped put this on. The last update I have is October 22nd, same time, 9 a.m. We are having another speaker series. It's called Data as Empathy. Data as Empathy. So I hope to see all of you there. And thank you, everyone, for coming, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, everybody.